Hi, so glad you're here. Today, we're going to dissect a big term and talk about the 5 major drivers behind it. That term is wealth redistribution. For the last 40 years, it seems like every time it comes up in a national conversation, it has always come up in the context of trying to take money from hard-earned people who earn that money and give it to undeserving people who haven't earned that money. Well, after we examine the 5 main drivers that I think every American should know about wealth redistribution, hopefully we'll put that myth to bed once and for all. We'll also, if you stay till the end, talk about the total dollar impact of what is really going on in the United States and why we need to reframe this issue if we want to have any chance of building a better future for all of us. So let's dive into it. First and foremost, wealth redistribution is not something that just came out of nowhere. It is made by people who have made decisions to make the system work this way. And let's peel the layer back just a little bit to demystify this. The first major way that we see wealth redistribution happen in the United States is through the differences between the productivity of what American workers are producing across the entire country and how do their wages correlate to that. In order to break this down in a way that's easy to understand, you can look at think tanks like the Economic Policy Institute and their work to chart out how has worker wages kept up or not kept up with overall productivity. And here it's pretty evident that come 1980 timeframe, when the Reagan administration started implementing a whole bunch of different tax policies, which we'll get into in a minute, that we start to see a real difference of before and after. Before the 1980 period, going back to World War II, worker wages overall kept up with productivity. So the more that people produce, the more that they were paid. And that felt like a fair system. We still had rich, we still had poor, we still had different tiers of wealth in our country, but they weren't as drastic as today. And from 1980 on, this idea that government is the problem that Reagan championed, the idea that the era of big government is over, this whole idea that we need to stop wealth redistribution going down means that American workers are producing more, but getting paid less for what they're producing. This is the first of 5 major pillars I want to talk about when we're talking about wealth redistribution in the context of how much wealth we're redistributing from the bottom or the working class portion of Americans up to the top 1 or maybe 5% of Americans. And the wages not keeping up with productivity is that first pillar. And you can see it in this graph. You can also see it in a bunch of other data visualizations. The next one, tax policy. We certainly had the Reagan Revolution and tax policy that started bringing in this idea that if you cut tax rates on the richest among us, that somehow they will reinvest that in the economy and that those investments will trickle down to the rest of us. We have done major tax changes that followed that logic multiple times in the last 40 years, and that has never proven to be true. And you can dive deeper because when we talk about tax policy, we only talk typically about the federal tax policy. But at the state and local level, it's a completely different picture. And here I have a couple graphics from the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy that really dives deep into this material. And on the left-hand side, figure 6, you can see the overall percentage that people are paying into taxes. And while at the federal level, the poorest among us are mostly getting money back from the federal government because they don't earn enough, they still have to pay property taxes. They still pay sales and excise taxes. And they pay a much higher percentage of their overall wealth and income than the richest among us. This is called a regressive tax system, and it's prolific across the United States. On the right-hand side, figure 3, you can look at who pays the least amount of taxes at the state and local level. And 41 states, the top 1% of wealth earners or income earners pay the least among us. Our tax system from the progressive era, from Franklin Delano Roosevelt all the way up to Reagan, was meant to be progressive. In this context, a progressive tax system simply means the more you earn, the more you should pay because the more you benefit from what society has to offer. I.e., if you're an employer, there's no harm in earning more than your average worker. How much is up for debate. But the reality is you as the business owner earning more are benefiting from all the public schools. You're benefiting from the public roads. You're benefiting more than your average worker is benefiting. So you should have to pay a little more percentage in taxes. That's how we used to have marginal tax rates of 90% when Eisenhower was president. We had marginal tax rates at the highest income bracket of 70% and 60% when Reagan took over. In our states, we have completely flipped that on its head. And we created a system where the top 1% are paying the lowest percent of taxes. It's not a fair system, and it's also a system that, again, redistributes wealth from the bottom working class portion of the population to the top 1% by having people not pay a fair share of their ability to pay based on the benefits they're receiving from it. The third lever I really want to dive into is the financialization and corporate practices. I did a deep dive into shareholder supremacy. I'll include a link in the details below. But this graph, which I've used several times, shows three things. One, it shows labor productivity, that greenish line, wages, the gray line, and then corporate profits. Now, why does this matter? Wages have effectively gone down. Productivity has gone up. I already covered the first point that wages are not keeping up with productivity. That's not new here. What the new concept here is, because we created a system that's all about shareholder supremacy, the value of what is being produced is going into stocks in different ways. And who owns stocks? Well, the top 10% owns 97% of the stock market. So yes, most of us working class folks have 401ks and we have stocks invested through our retirement funds. But even when that's all included, the top 10% of the country benefits exponentially more from those stock prices going up than everything else. And we created a system where profits matter more than growth, more than stability. And that is having us lurch from bubble to bubble. And we can dive deep into that if you want. But for here, just know that the rules we made to maximize profits has definitely maximized profits. That's the orange line. It is indisputable. Whether that's good for everyone, for us to redistribute wealth from the bottom working class to the richest among us, that's what we're talking about right now. And I would argue it's not good. This next one is really the fourth lever. There has been a massive decline in unions or collective bargaining. Why is this important? Well, each individual worker going to negotiate for a better salary to share more of what is actually produced is hard for an individual worker going up against a massive corporation. The way that we have done that in the past is by grouping together and all of the workers combine, i.e. collective, go bargain with your employer for more fair wages. Union membership has gone from 20% in 1985 down to less than 9%. And if you break this out, and this is a graph from USA Facts, but if you break this out into private sector versus public sector unionization remains high. Private sector is down about half this level. So we have taken the productivity that workers are producing, put it into stocks as a system, and then we also have decreased overall union representation, removing individual workers' real power to actually negotiate. It's all about negotiation power in this, and we have minimized it as much as possible. Finally, the fifth driver, wealth by asset class. So here you can see over time from the 90s till now, at the bottom, 50% of Americans, which is, by the way, over 100 million people, wealth hasn't really moved at all. Some measurements show it declining. The wealth of the sort of 50 to 90% does look like it's going up. But if you take away that top 10% bracket, it's actually going down. And then you can see the blue and green, the light blue and green, the top 10% broken out in a few different ways. The overall wealth has done nothing but gone up dramatically. This is wealth redistribution. We do it as a default. We do it as a default, not in the way we talk about in politics. We do it as a default from the bottom to the top. And yet we built into our system this idea that if we want to really talk about things like taxing the rich to pay their fair share, then what happens in the political discourse? Name calling gets thrown around. Socialist, communist, however bad people think it is. When really the conversation is, how do we stop the wealth redistribution that we have enshrined as our status quo for the last 40 years? That isn't socialism. It's not communism. It's just, how do we make a more fair system? How do we have a market system that has more fair rules that govern how it works? Why is that important? Well, at the end of the day, we have to look at, what does this mean for workers across the United States? And this is a graph that came out of a Democratic report about AI, because as AI is coming on board, we're likely to see that productivity is going to go through the roof once it gets realized. Whether or not workers will benefit from that is genuinely an open question mark. If it follows the trends from the last 40 years, most likely the answer is no. And so how much have we already redistributed from the bottom to the top, and how much more can we before something seriously breaks is a fair question. Well, this graph just takes the idea of what people are paid versus what they produce, measures the difference in between over time, and they come up with a figure of $79 trillion just from 1975 till now. Our Debt as a country is $36 trillion. It is an incredibly inefficient way of moving wealth from the bottom to the top. And we've been doing it for so long that we don't even realize how much wealth we have taken out of the working class in this country. Imagine everyone in the country earning about a third more than what they do right now without prices changing. That last comment, I will have to dive deep into in a different video because there is a way to do that. Finally, let's talk about what it means for today's political environment. Let's treat this as a scorecard. Top 5 drivers. What has our current administration done to either accelerate this or decelerate it? First, wage stagnation and productivity growth. Well, President Trump signed an executive order trying to limit the liability for employment enforcement, making the wage stagnation more of a problem. We are actively trying to make this worse right now with what we're currently doing. Tax policy favoring the wealthy. Well, in the big, beautiful bill is one of the largest tax cuts in our history for the top 1 and 10% of this country at the expense of programs that are benefiting working class. This is being made worse. Financialization and corporate practices. President Trump has instituted a regulatory overhaul to deregulate as much as he possibly can to maximize corporate profits. This was part of his campaign. This was part of what he promised. This is becoming worse. Decline of unions and worker bargaining power. The last sector in our country that still has a strong union presence is the public sector. And President Trump and his administration has ripped up a lot of the labor agreements. The legality of that is being fought in courts across the country. This is a clear attack on collective bargaining in our country right now. Finally, asset ownership concentration. Well, President Trump is very much in the process of taking benefits that went to working class people through SNAP, Medicaid, Medicare, and other programs, and having that fund the tax benefits going to the top 1% so that they can become even more wealthy. On all 5 of these major levers that are the biggest drivers was driving wealth inequality and wealth redistribution, President Trump, despite of his entire campaign to be a blue collar campaign, everything he is actually doing in office is making this problem worse. This has to be one of the worst scorecards in American history. And yet, when we talk about it, we always talk about it as though if you use the word wealth redistribution, you are trying to take from people who deserve it to people who don't, when the exact opposite is true. At the end of the day, whether we're talking about just ending these current practices to go back to what we had in 1980 or doing more to offset it, to actually get back to a more fair system, it's not about socialism. It's not about communism. It's about workers across the country being paid a fair wage for a fair day's work. That's what we're talking about. Be part of the change. Talk to your neighbors, talk to your friends, talk to your family. Dive deep. Please, I went through these really fast. Stop on these videos. Go visit the websites. I included all the sources and I'll include them down in the description. Don't just take my word for it. Do your own research. Talk to your friends and neighbors. Talk to your elected representatives and start normalizing this conversation of stopping the wealth redistribution from the bottom to the top. Thank you. If you haven't yet, please click like on this video, drop a comment below, and click that subscribe button. It'll help the YouTube algorithm make sure that these videos are getting into your feed. Thank you.